Okay, recording. So great to be here with Zach Siegel in Chicago, who has just published a great story, the most in-depth story I've seen so far on what Oregon has just voted for in terms of drug policy. I think this is a really big deal. I think it hasn't perhaps got the attention it deserves on a national level so far for various reasons. A lot happening in the US right now with the pandemic and Trump being voted out of office and election disputes and this kind of thing. But this is very, very important. I think this could be the key to a bigger change, or one of these steps in a bigger changing of drug policy in the United States and globally. Something I've been looking at for a long time, particularly with the violence and the cartels in Mexico and trying to deal with this. How do you change the world of drug trafficking? So Zach has got a really interesting story, well worth reading, on Baffler. I'll send a link to the story, looking at really what happened and what the changing law says. Now, so just getting a bit back, Zach's a journalist who's been covering a lot on drugs, on addiction, on the opioid epidemic and this problem and solutions to it. So, and I covered the change of law in Washington state when they legalized marijuana. And it was very interesting to see how that became the kind of political movement, the politics behind that. How would you say, what was the movement? Who were the people who were pushing this ballot measure? Who were they, and what was their experience to come to the table with this?
Yeah, it's a pretty eclectic group of people, and that's typically what I find in the world of drug policy and drug law reform in the U.S. It spans the political spectrum for sure. You get people with maybe more of a libertarian bent to them who aren't technically, part of any kind of left-wing movement, but they align with people who would consider themselves progressive on drug policy issues. So it is an interesting political intersection to be reporting at for sure. And in Oregon's a very blue progressive state. And if you look at the returns in the voting, absolutely Portland dominated and came out hugely in favor of Measure 110, which is the decriminalization measure we're talking about. And it's a very progressive, very blue, very liberal city. And I think based on the people who I spoke with, who are the organizers and petitioners and backers of Measure 110, I think they mostly fall on the more left-wing progressive side of the political spectrum. A lot of people in the harm reduction movement, people like Haven Wheelock, she works at a syringe exchange in Portland, handing out syringes to people who use drugs and giving them services. She was one of the chief petitioners and someone I've been talking to, a lot since Oregon passed this. And so people like Haven, and as well as the Drug Policy Alliance, they are also, I wouldn't consider them, straight up left wing, but they absolutely have huge victories in the world of drug policy reform. And no doubt their backing and investment in Measure 110 was hugely critical to it passing. And so that's sort of the main backer. And then there's even people like Mark Zuckerberg and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and they donated, I believe, $500,000 to see Measure 110 pass. So like I said, you get this sort of eclectic group of people. And at the base of this, what I think unites all of them is that the drug war in America and its export abroad in the world is destructive and harmful, and people, I think, truly believe that. People truly see that, and I think they're very everyday people are, I think, could be persuaded that something like decriminalization is the right step, is a step in the right direction. And I think based on the overdose death rates, the spread of HIV and hepatitis C, the pandemic inducing social isolation and causing so many so many problems that it's hard to be alive in America right now and not know someone who has struggled with drug use. And I think if you talk to these people, they don't think their loved ones should be criminalized for self-medicating or for developing an addiction.
So, Nine is a very important point you said about the, it crosses political lines. I think this is an issue which in America and beyond America, we can unite people of different political beliefs in the idea of drug policy reform, because, many people, in fact, you had Mississippi, I believe, voted in favor of medical marijuana legalization, for example, with a very high percentage. Now, what would you say exactly? So Measure 110 is the name. And I've read these things, in your story about this, it changes, for small amounts of drugs, it's only $100 fine. It's kind of like getting a parking ticket. But also it has this idea of, in the same ballot initiative, about channeling marijuana tax and creating funds for addiction treatment. Can you kind of explain technically exactly what ballot 110 does, Measure 110 does?
Yeah. To put it simple, it's really, I described it as a 1-2 punch. So the first thing it does is strip away criminal penalties for possession of personal amounts of drugs. And basically what that means is decriminalization. It is no longer criminal to be in possession. So that if you get caught with personal amounts now in Oregon, or at least starting, I believe, February 1st is when it kind of kicks in and changes, then you can be fined $100. It's a $100 citation. It's non-criminal. It's like more like a speeding ticket or a traffic violation. So the seriousness is very low. And then let's say you don't want to pay that fine, you can agree within, I think, a certain amount of time, I believe it's 45 days from within the citation, you could go to a addiction recovery center, get a screening, get a health assessment, talk to a counselor. And if you follow through on that process, then you do not have to pay the $100 fine. And this is where a good seg into the treatment side of things. So right now, Oregon ranks almost dead last in terms of access to addiction treatment in the U.S. And that geographically, it's very rural. There's a lot of areas that don't have a lot of people living in it. So obviously there's not like a methadone clinic in rural Oregon, but nevertheless, there is a huge issue with access and capacity in the treatment infrastructure in Oregon. So what Measure 110 does, and I think one of the more thrilling, kind of exciting aspects of it, is it creates this huge pot of money that programs and addiction treatment facilities and harm reduction organizations and all kinds of different organizations can apply to and get grant funding. So potentially tens of millions of dollars on top of an already pretty sizable investment is now strictly created for public health, addiction treatment, and harm reduction services. And so in Oregon, and I think this is true in a lot of places in the US, you can decriminalize and strip the criminal penalties, but that's not necessarily going to fix the structural drivers of drug use, of addiction. It's definitely a big win to stop criminalizing, but the key aspect, and I think making things better for people who do use drugs and suffer from addiction, is this huge investment in treatment. And that's where you sort of get the Portugal model that I alluded to in the piece. Portugal, they did decriminalization, but it was followed up with a massive investment in basic health infrastructure. So those are the two key pieces that Measure 110 is doing.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. I think, say, Oregon has become the new Portugal. That's kind of a good slogan or kind of phrase that people can understand. One thing I struggle to kind of get a sense of in the United States in terms of drug addiction is, I saw this study by the American Medical Association, which I've cited a few times in pieces, that 90% of people who need treatment for addiction don't get it. And that seems such a stunning number, 90%. So, you know, you've been talking and reporting with people suffering from drug problems, substance abuse problems. What's the process? I mean, if somebody's, you know, got like, you've got somebody, whatever in the US, I mean, but in Oregon, for example, they're suffering from heroin addiction. They want to seek help. Why are they not getting it? You know, what does it look like? Is it because they don't have money? The government give, you know, what's the whole process there?
Yeah, this is where the U.S. healthcare system just appears to be very messy and frankly bad at what it does. So we spend so much money on healthcare, health insurance, on so many things, especially relative to other wealthy developed countries, and we have worse outcomes for it. So we have this huge investment in health, and people just don't get what they need out of the system. And that's, I think, across the spectrum, even outside of addiction treatment. But specifically with addiction treatment, I think there's something that we don't ask ourselves enough, especially in the media and also policy making wise, is what do people want? And I think addiction treatment in the US is very focused on abstinence only approaches that frankly can sound very religious and center beliefs in higher power, a lot of 12-step sort of fusions with what sounds like healthcare and therapeutic treatment with 12-step and group therapy. So I think this model has really dominated the American addiction treatment approach. And I just think people may not want that. And so when we hear that only 1 in 10 people who have addiction actually get treatment for it, we should also be asking, well, what % of them actually want treatment? And if they don't want treatment, well, why is that? What kind of services or programs would actually appeal to them? And I think that's what Measure 110 actually has the potential to kind of do, because there's a huge pot of money now and what will be called the Oversight and Accountability Council. It's made up of doctors and social workers and epidemiologists, but also people who have a history of addiction or have had run-ins with drug enforcement. They'll also have a seat at this table where essentially they will be choosing how to disperse these funds. And so I think you'll have a much broader range of voices and people who've been sort of excluded from decision-making tables previously, now having the power to think through what people want and enact that in giving money to programs that maybe historically have been way underfunded. And so I just think that there's a huge possibility and potential for Oregon to just show that if you create programs that people actually want and that treats people who use drugs with dignity, with respect, and treat it as an actual health condition, and remove a lot of the moral judgment and especially the criminalization, you might find that people are much more willing to engage with systems that purport to help them, but maybe haven't in the past, and now maybe might actually help them now. So I think there's a lot of.
So it's quite an interesting case. Yeah. So you brought into saying that actually it's part of this figure. One of the reasons the figure's so low is that the groups offering help are often coming from a Christian, evangelical perspective, for example. Although I have found in my own experience seeing people in rehab that spirituality is a part of this, and when people become bad addicts, often it is this kind of real lack, and even some of the more secular ones often use kind of same spiritual language in different ways to kind of find these things. But that was interesting what you're saying. So there's also an idea of kind of creating this fund and distributing this fund to different kinds of groups with outreach in communities. Now there's a gap here. So people kind of understanding, and some people who aren't super familiar with the terms get confused between decriminalization and legalization and these kind of things. So it's kind of seems quite basic to us. So, legalization, you create marijuana dispensaries, people can go and buy marijuana like alcohol. Decriminalization means with small amounts. And do they have a list? Is there a list going to be published with different quantities of like heroin or crystal meth or different stuff?
Yeah, it's a little wonky, and so I think some of the weight amounts it varies by drug, and I think so. There is like a threshold at which, say, you have 50 pills of oxycodone and you're not prescribed them, and you're kind of possessing those. That previously I think would have been a felony, and you could maybe get intent to distribute or something like that. But the law also makes that a misdemeanor. So even if you do get caught with drugs in a relatively, what some might consider a higher amount, I'm pretty sure that's no longer a felony. And then when it comes to personal amounts, like say if you have a gram of methamphetamine and you're a user, I'm pretty sure, a gram, a couple grams, that is probably the amount that you're working with, where if you get caught with, you're probably not looking at additional charges.
Right, but they're not going to publish a very, that's a bit like kind of, what's the word, ambiguous, or people can make the decision. Oh, it's only a small amount. Is there not going to be like a strict table? They might publish at some point saying, like in Mexico, they decriminalized actually possession of drugs in Mexico in 2009, and there was a table, supposedly saying, this, you can actually put it on the scale and weigh, okay, you're inside the amount or you're over it.
Yeah, I do think that there actually for sure will be that publicly available kind of information about weights and what weights are in the clear and which aren't. I don't think I've like seen an actual strict breakdown of it, and as I was looking into that, it felt like it was sort of maybe a bit ambiguous, though it could just be that that's they're just not at that stage yet. I think we'll eventually, probably before the law kicks in, that will be clearly labeled and public, hopefully.
No, so this is the decriminalization stage, which is very interesting and a big deal in the United States, because this is the first place to do this and really changes that whole system of arresting people for drug possession. But it doesn't go as far as legalization. And so the problem I see with this, and perhaps it is part of the path we're going on, you need to go through, but the problem is that drug dealers can still come there and sell drugs. Talking about Mexico, traffickers can still bring heroin from here up to the United States, up to Oregon, sell heroin, and customers can still buy it. And in fact, people could argue it makes even the market easier. Do you see any way or any people talking about how to go that step further? And I mean, you could argue, well, if it helps rehabilitation, you can reduce the number of heroin addicts in the US buying this stuff. But what else can we, what can we do in terms of the heroin market? Do we have to just leave in this kind of half, this where you decriminalize the use but still criminalize the market and help addicts? Or what are your thoughts, or people you've been talking to, with any concrete ideas in a long-term idea about this in drug policy reform?
Yeah, I feel like decriminalization is sort of the first, like if you're a gamer, like there's bosses at the end of every level, like decriminalization is the first boss. Like you cannot get to a fully regulated, legalized market without taking a bunch of steps to get there. And this is how people have told me they're thinking about it, where basically maybe they're thinking on a decade-long timeline, where you have a few states decriminalize, and then that states who legalize cannabis can replicate the Oregon model and basically also end prosecutions and fund treatment. And I think as states sort of do that and the dominoes begin to fall, then that creates a much more welcoming environment for perhaps something like, it's called the safe supply movement. And this really started with doctors in Canada prescribing diacetylmorphine, which is heroin, or hydromorphone, which is Dilaudid, to people who were really struggling in the market because all they could get was illicit fentanyl, which is super potent, super dangerous, and people don't want it. And so doctors were thinking, well, let's get you out of this dangerous market, and I can just give you the opioids that you need. And they're safe, they're weighed out, they're pharmaceutical grade. And so, you know, I think a lot of people think that that's the ideal condition to reduce many harms of the current market, which you're right, decriminalization does not solve for adulterated heroin. It does not solve for selling quantities of drugs and unknown potency. So there's still a ton of unknowns in the illicit market, which will still exist. And frankly, I don't see how even in states that legalize cannabis, for instance, there's still a black market for cannabis. I mean, I just don't know how to solve for that problem without introducing.
So on that note about the interstate, yeah. I met somebody one time who was growing marijuana in Oregon and then also growing excess, and would go to Chicago and sell it to, you know, quite big amounts to the Latin Kings, you know, guys in Chicago and stuff. So there's still, I mean, that's the thing, I guess, with drug policy reform. It's always still, this is not like one button that changes everything. It's still a big, slow thing, but maybe moving in the right direction. I mean, there's the numbers you put, which were estimates about the number of, you know, like they're going to save a lot of money by sentencing less people and arresting less people for basically drug offenses. Now, one of the things I was unsure about is how you actually, you say what it would save, you know, rather than having, you know, you would by like 90% or something, you know, this number of people arrested on drug offenses. How would you actually channel that money? Because if the police are no longer arresting people on drug offenses, but the police still get their same salary, you know, they could spend time concentrating on violent crimes and murders and assaults and stuff, but they still get the same salary. The judges, you know, have less cases. They don't have to deal with all this, Jim blogs up on for, you know, meth possession, but they're still getting the same salary. So how do you actually remove resources or transfer resources to treatment from enforcement in that sense?
Yeah, so basically it's written into Measure 110 that, you know, whatever money police were spending on simple drug possession arrests and processing those people and prosecuting those people and jailing those people. So this is going to reduce, like you mentioned, by potentially 90%. So that will free up some criminal justice resources. And so basically the ballot measure, you know, in the language of it has earmarked, you know, this money that is currently being spent. So whatever savings come from this reduction in arrests and policing and incarceration, we're sort of going to tag it, silo it, and every 2 years there's an evaluation and an audit of this measure. And so like sort of every 2 years, and Oregon does things on I think biennial kind of basis, like the budget happens every 2 years. So after the 2-year evaluation and audit of this, there will be a pot of money also coming from policing and incarceration and courts and prosecution over to the fund that will also have the cannabis tax revenue. So those are the two main streams of funding, and that's sort of the architecture of the streams. And the major funding stream is still going to be cannabis tax revenue.
Right now, you know, I can see one of the issues that people might kick back on these things, one of the alarm bells it might spark with people, is this idea. I mean, you have seen, and I've seen this in various cities, particularly towards the kind of west coast of the United States, this kind of growth of like homeless people and people with drug substance abuse issues, kind of, you know, in city centers and this kind of general bad environment in those places. How do you think this kind of plays into that, or this idea of decriminalizing plays better into the idea of how you treat those kind of general issues of the kind of the environment, the safety, both for those people themselves suffering and for the, you know, the city generally?
Yeah, again, I can speak to the context in Portland, which just overwhelmingly voted in favor of this. And I think if you talk to people in Portland, everyday people who aren't drug policy activists and things like that, I think you hear things like, things are already, you know, so bad. We have a huge homelessness population. We have really rampant inequality, and the people who are unhoused, who are using drugs in public because they have nowhere else to go, who are overwhelmingly targeted and frankly harassed by police. There was a report, an investigation that found in 2017 over half of the arrests in Portland were people who are unhoused and are just outside and are sort of sitting ducks. So I think if you just ask people kind of basic questions like, what are the problems in your city and what do you see? I think a lot of them will talk about the unhoused and homelessness issues and sort of public nuisance kind of things and kind of public consumption of drugs and intoxication and that kind of stuff. And it flows pretty easily from there. Like, if these are the problems and we've been criminalizing all these people and arresting them and piling on charges and sending them through this revolving door of arrest and courts and these sort of programs that are tied to the criminal justice system, I think people kind of see this and be like, this clearly isn't working. Like, we need to go in a different direction. And I think it just sounds much more simple, honestly, and more humane to just say, stop arresting them and give them services, right? And I think that's a pretty easy formula for people to grasp. And so I feel like in the US, especially since George Floyd's death last May, that sparked what I think, at least in my lifetime, I'm 31, I have never seen an uprising this large in my life. I have never seen millions of people protesting all around the country in my lifetime like this. So I think there's a major tipping point in attitudes about the way we've been doing things, which for decades has been brute force, criminalization, harsh sentencing laws. All these things are part of the problem, and that, you know, crime in America, it's not caused by just one thing. That there are so many different aspects and factors that lead to crime. And, you know, people will obviously be critical of Measure 110 and will want to poke holes in it and will try to connect it to an increase in drug use, or try to maybe even more cynically say that decriminalization is causing Portland's problems now. So I think there's going to be absolutely a political battle for the future of decriminalization. I don't think because Oregon just did it that, you know, with a snap of fingers, problems are going to be fixed. So I think it's going to take, in one sense, and I tried to articulate this in the piece that I wrote, is that passing Measure 110 is only the first step. Now comes actually maybe the harder part, which is the commitment and follow through to build out new health infrastructure, and the commitment and follow through to ensure that police and the whole criminal justice system changes the way that they approach people who use drugs, and that and that people who do use drugs are not seen as frankly lepers, and that people who are no longer criminalized, I think it'll be much easier to build their humanity back and sympathy for them back. So I think all of this is part of the frankly political and more so even cultural changes that are required to put us on a different path. And so decriminalization, I think, is just the first step. There must be, like I said, huge commitment and follow through to make sure that this works. And if it doesn't work, I think the risks are pretty huge. It could, kind of set us back, and people will have to think of a new way to unravel the drug war.
So just the last question then, to finish this off. It was fascinating and great to see you really on this story. So I've been covering this for a long time. I've been covering 20 years now, the drug violence in Mexico. Before that, I grew up in the United Kingdom with a lot of drug addiction around me. When back in 2012, when they legalized marijuana in Washington State and Colorado, it kind of felt like that was a big pop moment. Wow, that has changed. This is a big change. I remember before then, there was always a line. I talked to older journalists and older people who would always say, legalizing drugs is a non-starter, drug policy reforms a non-starter. Even I remember actually in 2012, a couple of months before that was voted, I was on a talk show, discussion show, and somebody said, legalization is a non-starter. And then they legalized marijuana a couple of months later. So do you feel, it's easy when you're covering this to kind of be swept up with this, but do you feel this is like a, hallelujah moment, a bang, this is a big change? Or what are your own sense on the ground of how big a deal this is and what this looks like in terms of changing things?
Yeah, I'm sort of naturally skeptical and pessimistic about the world. And even I, looking at what Oregon did, was pretty frankly shocked by it. I think what it did, this victory, I think really kind of just re-sparked a lot of people's political imaginations of what's possible. And I think it's especially salient to say that because we've been living under President Donald Trump for the past 4 years. And I think seeing him lose the election, it's almost like a fog of brutal humiliation and oppression has sort of lifted a little bit. And just seeing him get rejected by the country, I think a lot of people felt relief and elation and joy, at least half of the country did. And then at the same time that happened, you had red states legalizing cannabis, like you mentioned earlier. Mississippi legalized medical cannabis, and South Dakota and Montana. These are very conservative states that did a very progressive thing. And seeing what Oregon did, I think taking all this together, yeah, I do think that this puts American drug policy in uncharted territory and on a new path that could really unravel decades of pretty frankly brutal and harsh drug policy. I think Measure 110 has the potential to do that. I'm not saying the battle is over and the fight is done and pack your bags and go home because you won. But I do think that this absolutely changes the overall climate and mood of drug policy reformers.
Yeah, well, great. We'll see. I think, it's definitely a big moment, and there's a lot of hard work. I think, I don't see this as as you say, it's conservative, it's Democrat, it's just, people generally, a lot of the time, working class people who are suffering this, but all kinds of people suffer addictions. But still there's some real deep core things in the United States, I think, about why it suffers so much addiction problems. I grew up in a community with a lot of addiction problems. I'm not saying it's only the US. but like some deep things in society that have to be kind of dealt with. But we'll see, and hope that like the billions, the trillions of dollars over the years of money going to cartels can, it can start to be reduced, to have some hope. Well, look, great talk to you, everyone. Check out Zach's great story in the Baffler and his work there. It's definitely worth reading, and we'll keep in touch with this issue, see what happens in the long term.